Welcome back to the Educator Wellness Revolution podcast. Very excited to have an old friend, Robert Barnett, on the program today, who's doing some amazing work for educators. So, Rob, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey in education.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited, Scott, to be on your podcast since I know we go way back to our days teaching in DC public schools. For me, I had taught a little bit before DCPS, but DCPS is really where my journey started. I taught 12th grade math at Eastern High School. And when I got there, I started teaching the way I had been trained to teach, which was like stand up at the board and give the day's math lesson. And it was just such a complete flop. Some of my students could understand, they had grade level skills, they were ready for a challenge. Other students had big gaps in their learning. They really struggled. They felt lost. And a lot of students weren't there at all, had big issues. Even then, many years before COVID with, chronic absenteeism. So I just felt like there's no way that giving one lesson every day is going to meet all of my learners' diverse needs. I wanted to keep teaching at Eastern. So I had to find an approach that would work. Essentially, what I did is I started recording my lessons on videos I created myself
Yeah.
and very, very simple videos. I would start a video call with myself, explain something, hit record, explain something, stop the video call, share that with my students. But that way, I didn't have to stand at the board anymore, trying to push them all at my pace. They could learn at their own paces. They could keep learning at home. They could ask me questions in class, and I could spend my time sort of sitting down with my students in class, answering their questions, getting to know them, building their relationships. Most importantly, I could make sure that they actually understood lesson one before they go to lesson two, which is important. Students should be mastering things as they go and as they get more complex. To make a long story short, I share this with a colleague, Kareem Farah, who taught downstairs from me at Eastern. We started a nonprofit basically just to train our colleagues at Eastern. In the summer of 2018, we trained 8 teachers, our colleagues, in our approach, how this worked, how to create videos and self-paced lessons and check students' mastery. In 2019, we trained 25 teachers. COVID came, there was just a huge surge of interest in our methods. Even though our approach was designed for in-person instruction, we felt like it helped teachers in virtual instruction, and we've grown since then. Today, we've reached about 80,000 teachers all over the world. Um, every subject, every grade level, and we help them address that fundamental challenge of teaching. When your learners have diverse needs, how do you challenge and support every learner every day? And how do you do that in a way that feels sustainable and empowering for you as a teacher? Like when I tried to teach one lesson per day to diverse learners, I went home every day and I just felt like a failure because I knew I had missed my advanced learners, gone over my struggling learners' heads, and some students had missed out altogether. When I started teaching like this, the modern classroom way, I felt a lot better and I enjoyed teaching much more too. So we're trying to help teachers have that same experience.
Yeah.
Um, Thank you so much for sharing that. That story was just making me think about when I was in high school and I had a teacher that like told us, he was like, we're gonna try a flipped classroom. And that like for me being a student, like I'd never really actively thought about pedagogy. I'd never thought about how my class was being taught. And it was like really insightful for me as a student to see a teacher like going out of their way and trying something new to better capture our learning needs. So yeah, that's just really exciting. Thank you for sharing that story. Um, in terms of how you think about pedagogy now, and you got a little bit into like how your understanding of pedagogy has changed over the course of your career, but what approaches are you actively like strengthening for yourself right now?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you mentioned flipped classroom because the modern classroom approach, I think, has a lot in common with the flipped classroom, notably that teachers use sort of digital means like videos to deliver direct instruction so that they can spend their time in class working closely with and building relationships with their learners. Of course, I think the modern classroom approach improves on the flipped classroom in two ways. One is that in the modern classroom, students move at their own paces. So in a flipped classroom, you might say, everyone go home and watch this video tonight, and then tomorrow we're all going to do the same lesson. That can be challenging because, first of all, a lot of students don't have good internet access at home, but also like some students are going to learn content more quickly and others need more time, and some students will be absent. So any kind of self-paced or any kind of teacher-paced class, I think, is going to leave students behind. And so I love a flipped classroom, but I think it also needs to be self-paced. And then it also, I think, needs to be mastery-based, meaning, a student should only move on when they're ready. When a student sees content and doesn't get it, and the teacher says, okay, we got to move on to the next lesson tomorrow, that's really stressful for the student. It sort of sends the message that they're not capable of learning. It creates a gap that's going to hurt them in the future. And it's stressful for the teacher too, because I know that if students didn't understand the basics, now they're really going to struggle with the complex stuff. So in the modern classroom, our approach, we're really pushing teachers, pushing students to say, make sure you understand lesson one before you go to lesson two. So it's like a flipped classroom, but I think it's improved in those two ways.
Yeah, that's interesting. All right, so I want to go back to the basics of like this is what we learn in teacher prep and where we are now, because I feel like there's a couple things that people are told that just like somehow we've like completely forgotten about, right? So one is zone of proximal development, right? And you just mentioned I came home feeling like a failure from teaching these lessons, the same lesson to everybody, because I was going above the head of some learners and not fast enough, right, to keep engaged my high flyers. And I feel like we've gotten to a kind of a simplicity of what's told to teachers, which is just like, just teach grade level content, right? And students will rise to the occasion. And now, first of all, that framing is a little bit built for people who are below grade level content, which is just like, just teach them the grade level content, build in whatever scaffolds you need to, and like make sure they get the grade level content. And then teachers are told to differentiate, right, for wherever students are. But that's a pretty tricky concept too, because in the traditional way of teaching, absent the time you might have them in groups, if you spend a whole lot of time preparing distinct materials for them at different lexile levels or different styles or approaches or, pedagogical methods, um, there's not it seems like a little bit of something we're told to do all the time that's really unattainable, right? Without the help of co-teachers, without the help of technology, that's not really something we can do. But it seems like we've gotten away from some of these basic philosophies and we just say, look, just like make it work, right? Teach at grade level content and just make it work. What's wrong with that approach? Like, where are we now with all that?
Yeah, I mean, what's wrong is that it's basically impossible. And you mentioned students who are behind grade level and students who are ahead of grade level. I think where this really breaks down is when you think about students who are absent, right? Like,
Mm,
and we know students are absent often. If you're not here on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and you come into Thursday's lesson, and there's no, and that's where like you're going to be lost. You should be lost, right? Because if Mondays and Tuesdays and Wednesdays lessons were worth learning, then you shouldn't be able to get Thursday's lesson right away. And so like we need an approach that is responsive to the fact that students come to our classes with different
yeah.
needs. I like the idea that every student can master grade level content. I think it's true. And I think that there's a push for equity in the idea that every student should be doing rigorous content. So I like that. We just have to balance that with the fact that learners need different things. And you mentioned differentiation. I mean, I think if my co-founder Kareem were here, he would say what he always says, which is it's the most overused and under-executed term in education. And you hear about it a lot, but it's kind of like how. And I think my approach to this is that usually when teachers are told to differentiate, we're asked to differentiate in terms of content. So the high flyers get harder stuff. The struggling students get easier stuff. We talk about low floor, high ceiling. And we do that because we assume that what's fixed is the time. So like in a 50-minute lesson, the high flyer can rise high and the struggling student can get the basics. The problem is the high flyer is always bumping their head against the ceiling, and the struggling students getting dragged along the floor. And I think the way I think we should differentiate is not in terms of content, but it's in terms of time. The high flyer who needs 20 minutes to master the lesson should take 20 minutes and then move to the next lesson. The student with learning gaps who needs 2 hours should have those 2 hours before they advance to the next thing so they can really get mastery. The student who is absent on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, when they come back on Thursday, they should start with Monday's lesson. And so they're all doing rigorous grade level content. They're just doing it at different paces and different amounts of time. And of course, that's challenging, right? When you have 180 days in a school year. But I think there are ways that teachers can sort of prioritize content, like here's what you really need to do, here's more of the aspirational content, to allow every student to really reach mastery of the core skills. I think we should think about differentiation more in terms of time and less in terms of like create your easy, medium, hard lessons for students. That just widens the gaps.
How do we make that engaging though? Because what I'm picturing is that like I go into a classroom, I'm sitting at the tablet or the computer, and I do my lesson and I get it done, so I get to go on to the next lesson. But I might have the feeling of like, I mean, for me as a learner, like I love to be like taken on the journey. Like I like to watch an engaging video, have someone really question me, what's the role of the teacher in all this to like make it engaging and it's not just you're just prodding through, going through one lesson to the next.
I'll tell you another term I hate, which is personalized learning. Because I think when we think about personalized learning, which people often associate with the Modern Classrooms project, what comes to your mind is students sitting in front of screens all day.
Yeah.
Because it's easy for a computer to personalize.
Yeah.
I think the more important part of it is the personal, right? The whole reason to send students to school is so they can interact with their teacher, so they can interact with one another. Otherwise, we just leave them on computers all day. So, so the question is really, how do we create classrooms that feel really human, where students are interacting with one another? I think that in a modern classroom, technology makes learning more human. Because when the teacher's standing at the front of the room trying to get a bunch of students to follow along with a lesson that's too hard or too easy, that's not really like high quality interaction between the teacher and the student. The teacher's trying to do crowd control, basically. But when the teacher has the video is short, 5 or 10 minutes. Now the teacher is sitting down with the students, getting to know them, building relationships. Students are free to work with one another, right? After they watch the video, they can close the screens, find someone else who's on the same lesson and work together. And that's much more human interactive, I think, than, sitting there quietly while the teacher is lecturing from the board. I think of a modern classroom almost like a college library. Some students will be on computers working themselves, maybe watching the video. Most students will be in small groups working together. The teacher's circulating to work with those students. Everyone's challenged, everyone's supported, everyone's learning. That's totally different from my experience when I was, standing at the front of the room trying to police behavior.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm thinking about, you're speaking of like moving from a more traditional form of pedagogy, right? Where, one teacher at the front of the room with the whiteboard. It's frustrating for students, asking them to sit still, to work at like a, an average pace. And I mean like mathematical average pace of learning. And it can be, stressful and demoralizing at worst for the educator at the front of the room. And so you've spoken about like how we can move towards a more relational and like human-centered learning environment. So I'm curious about how the modern classroom sees teacher wellness and teacher retention.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it's stressful and disheartening at worst. I think that traditional instruction is stressful and disheartening at best. Like I feel like sometimes I just wanted to, just go home and put my head in my hands and never come back because I was working so hard to control behavior and plan a lesson, and I just saw that it was really missing the mark, and it was miserable for me. And I had I was sort of being told like differentiate and do this and do that and do this. And none of it really worked until I was able to redesign how instruction worked in my classroom. I can just share my experience of that, which is that I didn't become a teacher so I could keep students quiet while they listened to me. I became a teacher because I wanted to work with young people. I wanted to support young people. I wanted to help them grow. And once I, you know, got down from the front of the room and sat down with my learners and had the time to help them and gave them the time to like achieve mastery and succeed, some for the first time in their high school careers in math, like I loved that. That was invigorating to me. That's why I wanted to be a teacher. It was the joy of teaching and the reason I wanted to be a teacher. So I've just felt happier day to day, whereas I used to feel like I've got to come in and put on this performance. How I felt once my classroom was up and running, the way I wanted it was, look, I'm just going to show up today and help my students learn. Um, of course, there was work, in the afternoon, sometimes the evenings to get to that point. I had to put in a lot of planning to get my lessons the way I wanted to have videos, to kind of create these clear paths for self-paced learning. But that was an investment that paid off. Once I had a video that explained a concept, I didn't have to repeat it 100 times. I just said to students, here's the video. Let me know your questions. Watch it at home. Watch it with your family. Your family can be involved. I'm here to help you learn. I'm here to support you. And for me, that's why I wanted to be a teacher. I looked forward to going to class because I felt like I'm going to help my students, not like, oh my God, like I hope they behave today. I didn't have to do that. Class they were challenged, they were supported, so they behaved because they wanted to succeed. And when a student was, disruptive in some way, I didn't get into this behavior showdown. I just could walk over to that student and say, hey, what's up? Like, let's figure out how to get you back on track.
I mean, you talked about the human element of this. We always say, I mean, schools are very much human places, and it's what differentiates them from a lot of other environments in some ways in terms of how we have to think about the culture. We've been in so many schools where, I mean, and I taught in one of these schools, you've probably experienced it too. There's so much pressure on academic outcomes that produce, in some ways, perverse incentives towards the way we teach and the way we act, right, in a school environment, to try to achieve short-term fixes, right, that are going to turn scores around that don't actually improve learning or don't improve engagement. Curious how and I think one of the things we've seen in those places is what we actually have to do is create a sense of momentum around pedagogy sometimes, or really good practices where teachers feel like they're not wary of anybody stepping into their classroom because it's just about oversight or accountability. They actually welcome people to come into their class because that's the environment, is we're all learning from each other here. But that environment is not easy to create. How do you think this model can help, or what are your views about like how do we create that staff culture where people feel like we're all helping each other become better teachers?
Yeah, I mean, I think about this language of investment, like investing the time in creating your videos leads to leads to more sustainable teaching. And I think investing the time in really thinking about pedagogy as opposed to some more short-term kind of pushes towards test scores can make schools better places for teaching and for learning. Oftentimes I hear teachers say things like, yeah, we got a test coming up and my students' scores need to go up. So I just got to take control. I've got to speak more. I've got to do more. I've got to work harder. It's like I've got to drag my students along with me as sort of the unstated part of that. What I think is when you need students to achieve more, you as a teacher have to do less, right? You've got to put the ownership of learning back on the students. You've got to make them pursue the knowledge, and you've got to be the person to help them. But that's different. Students aren't used to that. Students like sitting and receiving things passively because it's easy.
Teachers aren't used to it either, right? I mean, it's like it's our default. Like we feel like, I mean, it's
Yeah,
like every parent's struggle too. Like you want to just step in and help and fix it, right?
totally, totally. I mean, and that's what we're trained to do. And when we watch the movies, that's what great teachers do. Like they stand up there and they stand and deliver, but it doesn't work. That's why, that's why I think test scores are there to begin with. And so I think we need to sort of step back and say, what do we want the learning experience to look like for students? What do we want it to look like for teachers? There is going to be discomfort here. Every year I had a new class of students. I had students who it took a week or a month to get used to it, right? They were like, oh, wow, Mr. Barnett's not, on me all the time. I can just talk with my friends. And then they realized, well, if they're just going to talk with their friends, like, they're not learning. They're missing out on an opportunity here. Once I start to get to know them, start to motivate them, they catch on, they want to work. But yeah, you have a great example with kids. Like if we want kids to acquire skills, we've got to require them and not always step in and sort of take on the work for students. So it's not easy to make this transition to your teaching or to get others to buy in. But I think as a parent, when I think what's the learning experience I want for my kids, it's much more like what I've described in a modern classroom. And I think if we can start from perhaps those first principles, what should teaching be? What should learning be? Have the conversation and be willing to invest in creating that environment, I think everyone will be better off.
You've talked a little bit about how to build that buy-in for families and for students. And I'm also just really sitting with that comment of like, if you want students to do more, you as the teacher need to do less, which is totally different than what our system expects of teachers. And I don't just mean what society expects of teachers, but what our system does. In terms of how we, consider professional development. And I know as well that educators, we often have this initiative fatigue, like, oh, there's another program coming in. Oh, there's another, teaching style that I need to master. And so I'm curious how you overcome that initiative fatigue and how you build buy-in with educators too.
Yeah, I mean, Modern Classrooms project grew from, my colleague Kareem coming to Eastern when I was there and us talking in a math department meeting and him feeling stressed and me not feeling stressed. Like that is the fruits of Modern Classrooms project. He's kind of like, wow, teaching Eastern is really hard. And I'm like, yeah, it is really hard, but if you try this, it will be a little bit easier. And he tried teaching like this and he said, wow, yeah, this really works. Like, and then other teachers started to hear about it. And to this day, by the way, when Modern Classrooms project partners with a new school or district, we tell the administrators, we're not going to train all your teachers. We're going to give you information about our professional development, and you're going to find the teachers who want to opt in to do this. And that has cost us, growth, and that has cost us revenue. But we believe that teachers should opt into that to this model because, maybe you're doing less in terms of the content explanation, but it is a lot of work to teach like this. So we asked teachers to opt in, and I think that the whole movement has grown from teachers seeing what's possible in other classrooms, trying it, and experiencing the benefits. I taught in DC public schools. I had plenty of top-down, here's what you're supposed to do kind of stuff. And I didn't like it. I didn't like being told what to do. What I liked was someone saying, here's an idea. Here's what's working for me. Here's how it's working for me. Here are all the challenges of the idea, but like, I'm seeing progress. Rob, do you want to learn more? And that's the approach that we try to take at Modern Classrooms. Unfortunately, we don't oversee professional development for all teachers everywhere, but I think to the extent that we can show teachers what's possible and give them choice and autonomy in what professional learning they pursue and what they do in their classrooms, I'm always highly supportive of that. I know great teachers, by the way, who have no interest in the modern classroom model. And I say that's totally fine. Like, you think this is going to work for you? It will. You think it won't work for you? It won't. That's fine. That's how it should be. I wish I wish teachers felt like they had that kind of autonomy.
Yeah, absolutely. Rob, I feel like everybody who's got an idea and they take it somewhere in education, there's some experience they had as a student too that plays into that inspiration. Do you remember a project you worked on, something you did as a student, a way you were taught as a student that you were like, man, if everybody could experience education in this way, um, we'd be living in the kind of system we need. That students would be a lot more excited and engaged to learn. Do you remember something like that as a student?
Yeah, I mean, when I think about great learning experiences I had, I had a handful of teachers who were really movie star type lecturers. Like they could just talk about whatever from the board and it would be exciting. But that's the exception, not the rule. I'm certainly not someone like that. Spent a lot of time, like I imagine both of you and many listeners, like bored in classes where the teacher was trying to, talk at us, or we were even doing a whole class discussion, which usually means the same couple students, dominating the class while everyone else sort of tunes out. When I think about really good learning experiences I had, it's when I was given interesting problems that challenged me, the time to work with my classmates on it, and teachers who like pushed, teachers who pushed us to to do good work on those. I mean, Scott, maybe you'll appreciate this as a history teacher, but when I was in my junior year of high school, we had to do a trial to see whether George Washington should be impeached, which you never really hear about. But like, there's a lot of things he did that, you know, were perhaps unconstitutional. I guess they were just still figuring out the Constitution at that point. But like, I worked with classmates. We had to come up to with an argument for this. Our teacher really pushed us. Like that was it was maybe more about the content than about the pedagogy, but those two things often go together. Like if you want students to engage deeply with content, you have to create a space where they can work with teacher and classmates together. That like today is, trigonometry and tomorrow's geometry and Friday is functions. That's not going to lead to deep engagement.
Yeah. Yeah, and just thinking about that, I have one more question for you, which is what needs to change about the way we do school so that something like Modern Classrooms Project and other models that are effective can take hold the way they need to for not just the people engaged in them, but for the broader system to improve? Meaning, is there something about our schedules, the way we frame and title classes, the structure of school itself is not very modern, right? Like, are there other things about the system you think need to be more modern for this to work effectively?
What needs to change for modern classrooms to work? Nothing. I mean, modern classrooms were built in the most traditional school system possible, which was, you know, comprehensive DC public high school. And, it's a method that's designed to work within all of the constraints of our traditional age-based, performance-focused school system. So we can do this in any system. What should change for education? I mean, I won't say everything, but a lot of things. I think the root of the challenge of learners in the same room having such diverse needs is age-based promotion and age-based education. I think students should progress through content based on their understanding, based on their mastery. And I don't mean that to say a 5-year-old should be in the same class as a 17-year-old. Like we could still have elementary schools and middle schools and high schools, but you shouldn't move from algebra 1 to geometry to algebra 2 just because you go from 14 to 15 to 16. In fact, I had students who were enrolled in algebra 2 while they were concurrently taking algebra 1 in the evenings because they had failed that. Like, they just moved along by their age and their lack of learning was evident. And it's not their fault. It's the system that has moved them through grade by grade, even though we know they don't understand. We look at the test scores, you know, I don't know, 30% of fourth graders are proficient in math. We move them to fifth grade anyways. What do we
Yeah.
expect? Like I said, it's a totally flawed system. So I would like us to start by replacing that. But in the meantime, modern classrooms is an approach that a teacher can take tomorrow, and whatever system you're in, do a little better, do a little better, feel a little better, teach a little better tomorrow.
We have learned doing this work that you need solutions to help the well-being of educators and students right now. And we need to fight for that systemic change at the same time. So I think there's all kinds of things we want to change about the system, and it's very helpful for teachers to have the tools right now to teach better, to share good teaching and good practices in ways that make things more sustainable for themselves, but also are better for our students. So we thank you for being here and sharing all that with us today. Rob Barnett of Modern Classroom Projects. I hope everyone will go check it out. Thanks for being here with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.